Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge.
There's a moment when a story stops being a rumor and starts behaving like a crisis, not because facts suddenly appear, but because reactions change, movement tightens, silence grows heavier.
Combs be released from jail? I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. The circumstances have changed, and I will tell you what. We did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. Think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations. That's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard, and they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, there has literally never been a case.
And everyone involved starts acting like damage control matters more than truth. That's when you know something crossed a line. It always starts the same way. A leak, a whisper, a vague report that something went wrong in a place designed to keep problems invisible. No details, no confirmation, just enough information to trigger discomfort. Enough to make people lean in, enough to make institutions freeze. Because inside locked environments, nothing spreads faster than the idea that control slipped. The public imagines confinement as rigid, predictable, almost mechanical, schedules, rules, guards, cameras, But that image only exists on paper. In reality, these places run on tension, on hierarchy, on unspoken rules enforced socially, not officially. And when someone enters that system carrying years of notoriety, the environment reacts like a body rejecting a foreign object. Attention follows instantly, not admiration, not fear, just attention.
And enthusiasm in her intimate life with Combs, including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted two different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, because I did. This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, two of the three locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking.
And attention inside confined spaces is currency. It changes dynamics. It shifts balance. It creates interest where there was none. Interest turns into pressure. Pressure looks for release. That's why alleged incidents don't need dramatic details to feel real. People who understand the environment already know how fragile the balance is. They know how quickly a routine day can tilt, how fast a situation can go from nothing to uncontrollable in seconds. So when reports suggest an attack, the question isn't disbelief, it's timing. Why now? Why here? Why this moment? And more importantly, Why the response looks the way it does. Because the response tells you more than the rumor ever could. Sudden isolation, restricted movement, reduced visibility, medical checks that go unexplained, schedule changes without context. These aren't admissions, they're safeguards. They're the system quietly acknowledging risk without ever naming it. Naming things creates accountability. Accountability creates problems. So instead, language becomes vague, carefully empty.
In addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case. And 3. General issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale was. In other words, there is a significant issue at the MDC related to the safety of employees and incarcerated individuals that require outside law enforcement action from multiple agencies to address. Importantly, MDC, as a jail, has a significant law enforcement presence within its walls 24 hours per day that are equipped with investigatory and often unregulated authority. Thus, the requirement of outside law enforcement agencies to ensure safety within the MDC is an admission that serious violence, mayhem, and chaos is occurring within the MDC that requires more than a Band-Aid raid, but rather surgery. Indeed, we are aware of ongoing threats of violence and actual violence in the facility such that Mr. Combs' safety is constantly at risk. And they go on to argue, though Mr. Combs has been a model inmate for his nearly year-long period of confinement, the violent conditions are still very much a concern for Mr. Combs and is an unnecessary confinement risk given the clear precedent of multiple similarly situated.
No incident of concern, no credible threat, matter handled internally. These phrases are designed to end conversations, not answer questions. But silence doesn't stop speculation, it feeds it. Inside, speculation is survival. Everyone watches everything. Changes are noticed immediately. When someone disappears from common areas, people talk. When routines shift, People assume reasons, and assumptions harden into narratives fast. Those narratives don't stay inside. They leak out through visitors, through staff, through people who don't even realize they're carrying fragments of a story when they speak. By the time it reaches the outside world, it's incomplete but charged. That's how a rumor becomes a scandal. Not because of what's proven, but because of how believable it feels. Violence inside isn't shocking, it's expected. What shocks people is when violence appears to pierce the illusion of control surrounding someone considered protected. That's when confidence in the system wavers. Because if protection failed once,
Mann Act convictions where defendants were released on conditions. Now, the government, by the way, would probably disagree with that statement of him being a model inmate. Remember when they accused Combs of trying to arrange three-way phone calls and buying the use of other inmates' phone privileges to try to make sure the government wasn't listening in, that he was having these private conversations, that he was allegedly trying to contact witnesses in the case, that he allegedly orchestrated a birthday campaign to help his public image while he was locked up. So if we hear a government response, I'm sure they're going to say something about that. Then the defense highlights he's not a risk of flight, he's not a danger to the community, which, by the way, I think are real key points here. But they seem to echo a lot of the same arguments that they have already stated to the court. And remember, they haven't been successful in the past. That he voluntarily came to New York last year to surrender himself to authorities, that he gave up his passport to his attorneys 6 months before his arrest, paid off his mortgage on his Miami home so it was free and clear for him to stay at while out on bond. He was just acquitted of the most serious charges that he was facing, which, by the way, carried decades, if not life in prison. That he's not a risk of flight. That's the basic argument. Now, when it comes to the danger argument, that is key. Why? Judge Subramanian had said after the verdict that the reason he was denying bail was because of Combs' violence, that his own attorneys admitted he was violent during the course of the trial. Well, here is what Combs' defense attorneys argue about that. Quote, the court noted that the defense admitted a history of domestic violence as to Miss Ventura and that he struck Jane twice in June 2024. However, we strenuously object that Mr. Combs poses a danger to the community, aside from a single instance on June 18, 2024, where Mr. Combs was provoked by Jane through her own acts of violence. There was no evidence of any acts of violence in the last 7 years. Indeed, the jury notably rejected the government's argument that the June 2024 incident constituted coercion when it acquitted Mr. Combs of the sex trafficking charge. Also, prior to his arrest in this case, Mr. Combs enrolled in a domestic violence program in which he participated until he was arrested and incarcerated in connection with this case. If released on conditions, Sean Combs will not be violent to anyone. As we said in court, this jury gave him his life back, and he will not squander his second chance at life, nor would he do anything to further jeopardize his 7 children not having a father and 4 of his children not having a parent at all. The court can fashion any set of conditions, and Mr. Combs will abide by any condition to make the court comfortable that Mr. Combs will not be violent toward any person. And that is when they propose the following bail package. That Combs will sign a $50 million bond secured by his home in Miami, that the bond will be co-signed by 3 financially responsible people, that Combs will reside in his home in Miami, that his travel will be limited to the Southern District of Florida, the Southern District of New York for attorney meetings, as well as airports that are necessary to travel between the two, that he will be placed under the express supervision of the U.S. Pretrial Services Agency, that he will report to that agency as directed, that his passport will be surrendered to pretrial services, that he shall not apply for any other passport, and they even highlight that the court can add other conditions too. Home detention, private security approved by the court.
It can fail again. And failure is something institutions fear more than wrongdoing. If an altercation did occur, it wouldn't resemble a cinematic event. No long struggle, no dramatic confrontation, just seconds, confusion, intervention, and then paperwork, lots of paperwork. The paperwork version is always cleaner than reality. What matters isn't what happened in that moment, but how quickly it was buried under procedure, how fast the environment was reset, how aggressively information was contained. Containment is the real response. People assume high-profile confinement means extra safety. In truth, it means extra pressure, extra scrutiny, extra resentment, extra interest from people who want to test boundaries just to see if they exist. Special treatment doesn't dissolve danger, it redistributes it. Sometimes protection isolates someone so completely that it creates new risks. Isolation breeds paranoia. Paranoia breeds mistakes. Mistakes invite testing. And testing is constant. Inside.
All the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous, and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict does not is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic, to be more of a victim's advocate. And also, once he completes these programs, he can say, look, I was once an abuser of women, abuser of drugs, abuser of fame, abuser of power and fortune, but look who I am now. And so I think that's a pretty powerful story. And frankly, people love comeback stories.
Yeah, they do love a good comeback story, but I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that this is all just for maybe a showmanship, or do you think it's all for PR? So that way, Diddy can walk out of MDC Brooklyn or possibly a potential prison and just be like, what, I am a changed person. But also in that same breath, what kind of message do you think that sends to victims out there who may have been abused or, something had happened to them by a high profile figure? They want to report this to police. They want to either go to maybe a civil lawyer, all of that stuff. But then after this trial, they are like, no, I can't do that. Look what happened in this case. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, there are definitely people who are victims advocates and victims themselves who think that this trial serves to kind of throw cold water, if you will, and chill victims who might want to come forward to express what happened to them, to initiate a criminal case, to initiate a civil case. They look at this case and say, at what cost is it to me personally to have to bare my soul, to only then be grilled on cross-examination, to have all of my...
Strength isn't about physical dominance alone. It's about perception. Who looks untouchable? Who looks nervous? Who looks watched? And who looks like they don't belong? Looking out of place is dangerous. That's why alleged attacks don't need confirmation to change behavior. Once the idea exists, the environment reacts. Staff tighten protocols. Access shrinks. Movement becomes limited. Interaction is reduced to necessities. The place grows quieter. Quiet doesn't mean calm. It means pressure building without release. From the outside, people demand answers. From the inside, people are told to keep moving, keep quiet, keep following orders. Two realities running parallel, never meeting. The public wants a headline. Institutions want time. Time smooths edges. Time dulls outrage. Time lets news stories replace uncomfortable ones. That's the strategy. Let attention drift. Let speculation exhaust itself. Let silence do the work. But silence leaves residue. Even if nothing happened, The belief that something could have happened.
My intimate details bantied about, in the media, and then to be judged and then go through all of that. And I walk away in some ways empty handed. Now, that's certainly one way of looking at things. And there's a lot of credibility as it relates to understanding how someone could feel that way. The flip side, because remember, the scales of justice isn't just one side, there's two sides. The other side, if you will, is at what point in time does a person pay in full their price to society? And then once they've paid the price for their transgressions, at what point do you then look at that person and feel like, hey, you could be a changed person. You can redeem yourself. There's things that you can do to essentially prove to us as members of the public, as clients, as customers, that, you're a changed man. And so that's the hill Diddy has to climb. Whether he climbs that hill or not remains to be seen. But it's definitely a hill that's in front of him. And some might say it's not a hill, it's a mountain.
It is a mountain for Diddy. I think it might honestly be Mount Everest. It's a large mountain for him to scale, for I think people to possibly forget in their conscious what we learned in this trial. And I remember when Sean Combs, we've been covering this since Cassie's lawsuit, since 2023, November of that year. And I just remember thinking that there would be some type of reckoning within the hip hop community, the Black community, as far as Me Too goes, something kind of similar. And I thought possibly, and I think maybe other people thought so too, that maybe Sean Combs was kind of that person that would, bring about this kind of reckoning in the hip hop community as far as Me Too goes. But do you think that can still happen? Do you think that will still happen?
Well, I think that Diddy's trial, served as a clarion call, a wake-up call, canary in the mine, so to speak, as it relates to you could be as powerful, as popular, as wealthy as Diddy. I mean, keep in mind, he called himself Brother Love. He got the key to New York City in the months or the year leading up to all of this, right?
Yeah.
And he was sitting on what some might say is the highest pedestal. And look how far he has fallen. Now, at the same time, you have that going on. And so people can look, if you really look at the case, and not just the legal case, but the case in the court of public opinion. And victims, if you will, won. Because he has, not only did he have a criminal case he had to deal with, but he has upwards of 20, 30 civil cases
I think even
that he's
more
also
than
going to have
that.
to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. And each one of those cases, even if it's not proved by the victim that it happened, he is still going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees for each and every single case, and maybe millions for the more serious and those that get further down the line. So he's not done paying for his transgressions. And I think that for other people who are in similarly situated positions of power and influence, they certainly took notes from the Diddy trial and figured out, hey, if I continue to act like a pig, pigs get slaughtered.
Yes, they do. And I just remember even in the outcome of the Sean Combs lawsuits that were filed, even probably before he was indicted, we were hearing and seeing more civil suits filed against other people. And even after this case, we've seen more high-profile figures have complaints against them, like, Tyler Perry and Shannon Sharp and Smokey Robinson, all of which have denied the allegations against them. But I do
Changes everything. Trust erodes. Fear settles in. The environment tightens permanently. That's the hidden cost of scandal in closed systems. It doesn't need truth to cause damage. It only needs plausibility. And plausibility already exists. People forget that these places aren't built to rehabilitate narratives. They're built to maintain order. Order doesn't require honesty. It requires compliance. So the system doesn't panic. It adapts. It absorbs the shock and seals the cracks. On the surface, nothing changes. Underneath, everything does. Chaos doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, in moments, in rumors, in sudden changes no one explains. And when chaos threatens to surface publicly, the response is never transparency. It's suppression, controlled messaging, strategic silence. People interpret that silence however they want. Some assume guilt, some assume exaggeration, most assume something is being hidden. And in environments where secrecy is the norm, that assumption isn't unreasonable. That's why this story won't end cleanly. It won't be resolved with a statement or a report. It will fade slowly, leaving behind questions that never get answers. Those questions linger. They resurface later in fragments, in interviews, in offhand remarks, in accounts that only make sense in hindsight. Truth inside closed systems doesn't disappear, it waits. Until then, what remains is tension, a sense that the situation is more fragile than advertised, that control is maintained, not guaranteed. And that when the illusion cracks, even briefly, it exposes how thin the barrier really is. That's the real scandal. Not whether an attack occurred, but how easily people believed it could have, how naturally it fit into what everyone already suspects about power, confinement, and risk. When belief comes that easily, trust is already gone. And once trust is gone, every silence feels loud. Every absence feels intentional. Every adjustment feels like confirmation. That's how a nightmare deepens, not through proof, but through perception, not through facts, but through the system's reaction to the possibility of failure. Failure is never admitted. It's managed. And management always leaves traces. The public may move on, headlines will change, attention will shift, but inside, the consequences remain: tighter control, deeper isolation, a heavier atmosphere. That's the part no one sees. Because the walls don't just contain people, they contain stories, and the most dangerous stories are the ones that never fully come out. They stay trapped inside, shaping behavior long after the noise outside fades. Until the next crack appears. And the cycle begins again,